e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, e5, c5, a3, bishop into c3, check, b into c3, knight e7, a4, alternative is queen g4, but Fischer says that his experiment is not much successful with this move. Okay, let us go back. The last move played is a4, queen c7, knight f3, b6. The idea is to eliminate the bad bishop with bishop rook 3. An alternative is bishop d7, bishop d3, knight b c6. But what is played after d6 is bishop b5 check. Bishop b5 check is a good move. Bishop d7, bishop d3. Instead of bishop d3, castles, bishop into b5, a into b5, a5, knight g5, h6, bishop h3, knight d7, knight f4, black castles. This was played by Ivko and Robert Brain at Southsea, 1967. Black has no problem. So let us go back, and the last move played is bishop d3. After bishop d3, knight b c6 is played. Fischer against West Germany Grandmaster Darga castled on king side. c4. Not castling on the king side. Let us go back and see what it is. After castling on the king side, bishop into h7 check, king into h7, knight g5 check, etc., which gives a strong attack to white. Let us go back and see the last move played is c4. After c4, bishop e2 is played. f6. Bishop a3 is played by white, keeping tension in the center at the cost of a pawn. Rook even is a solid but less aggressive. Fischer tried the same pawn sacrifice against Mendes in the 1962-63 US Championship with slight but significant difference that black's b pawn still on d7. The sack may well have been unsound in that game. After bishop a3, f into e5 is played. d into e5. Instead of d into e5, in that game Mendes declined and castled. After rook e1, he got a cramped game. F into e5 is answered by knight into pawn, keeping the king file open. Let us go back and see. After f into e5, d into e5 is played. White doesn't have anything to show after. Let us see that also. Knight into e5, knight into e5, d into e5, queen into e5, rook e1, queen into c3, bishop h5 check, g6, bishop g4. Instead of bishop g4, bishop into e7. Let us go back and see. Bishop into e7, king into e7, queen into d5. Queen into d5 is the worst move because queen into rook. He has to take it with his rook and he is losing his queen. So instead of bishop e7, bishop into e7, bad move. After bishop g4, let us go back and see. After bishop g4, queen f6, etc. So let us go back and see what is played after d into e5. Knight into e5. Instead of knight into e5, let us go back and see. Instead of knight into e5, black castles, knight d4. Followed by f4 is very strong for white. The last move played is knight into e5. The threat is knight into knight, queen into knight, bishop h5 check. After rook e1, knight into f3 also playable to avoid that combination. But what is played is knight 7 c6, knight into e5, knight into e5. On knight f7, let us go back and see this combination. On knight f7, knight f7 is a bad move. Playable but also bad is knight g6, f5. After knight f7, let us go back and continue that combination. After knight f7, bishop h5, g6, bishop h5 is a good move. Black castles on queen side, f into e6, bishop into e6, rook into e6, g into h5, queen into h5. Here white stands much better. Let us go back and see what is actually played is knight on the 7th flank is moved to e6, knight into e5, knight into e5, f4. Knight goes back to knight c6, bishop g4. Black castles on queen side, bishop into e6, bishop into e6, rook into e6, rook d7, f5. To continue with the pawn f6, which gets grip on the bishop file. On queen f3, let us go back and see. Instead of f5, queen f3, knight d8, driving away the rook. Rook e5, queen c6 is equal. Now let us go back and see. The last move played is f5. knight d8, rook e3, queen f4, rook f3, queen e4, a5. a5 is a excellent move. Knight c6, a into b6, a into b6, queen b1. Opening the a file is already decisive. On king b7, let us go back and see. On king b7, bishop c5 wins easily. Or on rook b7, f6, g into f6, rook into f6, d4, queen b5. But what is played is, let us go back. But what is played is, after king c7, bishop c1 is played. Queen e8 check. But there is no satisfactory defense for bishop f4 check. On knight king 4, let us go back and see. On knight king 4, bishop f4, rook e8, queen b5 penetrates decisively. Or after bishop c1, queen king 8 check, rook bishop 1, queen into pawn, bishop f4 check, king knight 2, king b7, queen b5, black resigns because there is no defense for queen a6 check. Black resigns after queen b5. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your time. Please subscribe so that you can see many more beautiful games of Bobby Fischer and Michael Toll.